again. Thank you so much for joining us for what will be the fourth and the last of a series of roundtables that are hosted and facilitated by Asia Forum. And before we dive into things, and I know that we're a little bit behind on time, since we started the week really just jumping into engaging in the conversations, I just wanted to maybe preface it a little bit by telling you a little bit about Asia Forum. Very briefly, just to let you know that Asia Forum was launched in 2021, and its working council consists of myself, Hammad, Nasar, Professor Ming Tempo, and John Tain, of course, master architect of this whole experience. And as a evolving project, the conversation really is about exploring how the lens and engine of the idea of Asia as both topography, imaginary, and a sort of wider expansive concept could be really useful to turn a lens on some of the critical issues that we've been discussing, especially this week, like the notions of ecologies and the environment and so on. And we're really grateful to the Lahore Biennale Foundation, Iftikhar Dadi, and John Tain, of course, and the Getty for bringing us all together. But I also like to thank the Bagri Foundation, who has been a sort of what we call the Sakti supporter for Asia Forum, because it's been supporting our development for these 3 years into thinking through the work that we want to do together. Yeah. And so before I start, I think Ahmad and I would like to share a few thoughts, perhaps that could be useful in thinking about publishing. I think when we think about publishing, i.e. publications, we tend to think of something very solid and material. Like, I get very excited when I finally get it in my hands. I can smell it, love it, the mustiness of old books all the way to like fresh, hot off the press, right? But at the same time, I think about the journey of publishing, right? Both from the moment of conception, the ideas, the research, from the immaterial to the moment that it starts to form, as something that's manifested in the material through design as well, right? And the long, painstaking editorial process, right? And in this way, I'm really interested in acknowledging that process before it hits becoming the object. And this is also because, I'm really interested in spiritual cosmologies and cosmographies. And I'm thinking of like artists who are working in that realm of the gesture as a form of publication, or, other forms of immaterial publication. For example, an artist I know is working with Islamic and stories as well as folklore from Malaya, and then thinking of fire as publishing, for example. And I think you mentioned earlier, Songdong, writing in water and so on, right? So I'm really interested in those ideas as well, and perhaps maybe that's something that we can continue to think about, that interrelation and tension between the material and immaterial in the ways that you work as well.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks everyone for bringing us at this panel to think about this thing that we call publications. I will briefly just recount an encounter of, we started what we would now call pop-up shows, Anita Dowd and I, under the rubric of Green Cardamom back in 2005. And I remember at that time having some young master students in gallery looking at a body of work, and I just asked them, well, what do you think? And these very studious, nerdish art historians, as you would expect, said, I don't know, I have to read. And I just wanted to think about, I want to read something. And that sort of really stunned me, but also I think brought, we often think about the ocular and the visual as being, oh yes, it's the work that we're looking at. But actually, I think also this idea between we cannot see until we read as something to think through. To think through what do we need before we can see, and then what we can perceive. And that actually really shaped Green Cardamom's publishing program. So in the first few years, what we would end up doing, because we focused on artists, and we defined it, who don't think in English. So how do you introduce the practice of artists who don't think in English And we thought that perhaps one way to do it would be to have people who think in the same language, but then to have people who have no access to that language. So to have two looks from different language perspectives at the same thing to help other people see. So with that, I want to start the ball rolling with art margins. And just as a little bit of jugaad, I'm sure we are now familiar with that term, because the projector comes straight into the eyes of the people who are talking in the middle. So what we're going to be doing is a little bit of musical chairs as we go between the three publication teams that we're doing. So whoever's presenting will go to the farthest edge. That does not reflect any kind of hierarchy other than just convenience. So with that, I'm going to invite Sanjukta and Sven to tell us about themselves and art margins.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this lovely introduction. I also want to thank the organizers of the Biennale, John in particular, and all the other organizers involved for having us, for hosting us, and for giving us the opportunity to present the publication. I'm here with Sanjukta Sunderason, one of my co-editors. I am the founding editor of Art Margins and also currently the editor-in-chief. And I'll say a few words about the publication, and then hopefully in the discussion we can touch on things that I'm not able or that I omitted in this brief overview. So I want to say a few words about what Art Margins is and does. It is an academic journal that's focused on contemporary art practices in the global margins. And the word margins is a word that sometimes has people wonder about, what exactly does that mean? We have thought a lot about the notion of the margins, and that's something that I'm very happy to discuss maybe after this initial presentation. Art Margins publishes academic research articles, but also translated documents that are relevant to the history of global art, review articles, and also, and this is an important aspect of the publication, it invites artists to contribute online because, on this level, we think of them as one team, even though the two publications, like I mentioned, are run separately. Okay, move on. So this is the editors. Myself and Sanjukta are obviously among them. I do want to say, and this might be something that we can focus on later on, that when you edit a journal over many years, you realize that the journal does not stay the same. It's not that anything materially changes, but as people leave the publication and new members come into the editorial team that runs the publication, its character changes. And, that's something that is both exciting and, also a little bit sometimes difficult because, you have to really keep up with these changes. And that's something that Sanjukta will say something about in a little bit, because we're really experiencing that. And I think it's all for the best. Things do evolve, and it's important to keep up with that. But obviously, when a publication has been around for more than a decade, while a core of people stays, it's natural that there will be fluctuation, and there certainly has been in our case. Next slide. So I want to say a few words about what kind of material Art Margins print journal publishes. So what we're interested in is material related to the histories of 20th century and contemporary art, but also art theory, art institutions, and curatorship. We place special emphasis on marginal histories and innovative critical and methodological perspectives. In a practical way, that means that we're less interested in publishing material that relates to so-called Western art histories, although the boundaries here are not always so completely razor sharp, of course, but that's kind of the program we've given ourselves. Then we're also interested in submissions that consider art within sociocultural, political, and theoretical contexts. And like I mentioned before, we welcome the work of artists and art thinkers who work outside of English-speaking and official circuits. Now, that's something that was already brought up before, and it's super important for us. Not only are we interested in artists and art historians working outside of English-speaking circuits, and that's not an easy thing to do, actually, to something I can say about more later. But we also do a lot of translation, both translation and also editing of articles written by art historians whose native language is not English. So we have a lot of work that we do that has to do with grappling with idioms, with languages other than English. And that creates a lot of work, but it's also kind of exciting, and we feel it's important and necessary because, you know, in another sense, of course, we are very much anchored in, you know, a kind of publishing context that is dominated by the United States, and there's no getting away from that either. So we're trying very hard to counterbalance that in other ways. So next slide. I've already mentioned a little bit of what kinds of topics the journal is interested in. Journals questions pertaining to art and politics, but also art's periodization and historicization, again, with some emphasis on what we call the global margins. Questions related to sovereignty and empire, post-colonialism, decolonization and their critiques, the global and its critiques, and this little add-on critiques is very important. So we're not interested in emphatically promoting the global or global art history or global art or any of that. We obviously take note of it, but we're also interested in offering stimulating and important and necessary critiques of all these concepts. And then we're interested in the transition from and towards socialism in different parts of the world. And that's a little bit the heritage of the original Art Margins publication that was, as I said, online, and that was developed in the context of the changes that came over Eastern Europe after 1989, and, you know, whose after effects in so many ways we're still experiencing, even though we're now very distant from these events historically. Now, Sanjukta wanted to say a little bit about one of these points here, one of the themes I mentioned, namely post-colonialism and decolonization. Those are two topics the journal has not traditionally focused on. We had a more Marxist orientation, a formalist orientation, but, you know, with having Sanjukta join the group, and also Elizabeth Hani, who is a specialist in African contemporary art, things have evolved, and we're now paying a lot more attention to these discourses and theories, and I'm very grateful for that. They won't be exclusive, but we've added them into the mix, and we're very happy about this. And Sanjukta wanted to say a few words about that.
Can you hear me? Yeah, just to talk about the change in directions that Sven mentioned. I joined Art Margins two and a half years back, something like that. Elizabeth Hani was already there. She specializes on in African art. Her work on Senghor and decolonization, some of you might be familiar with, was foundational in my own studies. So Betsy and I, what we are trying to do is, bring in post-colonialism into the conversation, into the mix of the global, but also acknowledge the enormous research that has been done in the field of post-colonial art histories. We have Iftikhar in the room and others who sort of formed the foundations of it, and it's been 2 decades. So while we want to bring in post-colonial art history into Art Margins, we also know that it has been a while. So even post-colonial art history needs to be updated. And what we want to do slowly in Art Margins is to put post-colonial art history in dialogue with current studies on decolonization, both historical studies of decolonization, something that I do, but also more epistemic. We were talking about epistemic justice, the more decolonizing art history. These are connected but different things. So that's one thing we want to bring in. But also, so that's one thing, bringing in decolonization in its multiple iterations, but also connecting to the legacy of Art Margins, which is about writing politically engaged, ideologically engaged art histories, legacies of socialism and post-socialism. And as people working on decolonization would know, the Global South and East Europe are connected. connected in real-time histories in the 20th century, but also contemporary concerns. So talking about global Easts, for instance, global South and East, that is something we are working on building connections on. One can't assume that the connections are just there. In scholarship, they have to be cultivated, but also connecting global North and South. This is something Betsy and I are trying to develop with this in mind. And I just want to quickly add this, maybe the uniqueness of Art Margins here. While we do have journals dedicated to particular regions, we have African art, you have South Atlantic Quarterly, and then you have journals in literature like post-colonial studies, interventions, etc. A journal dedicated to thinking about marginalities in new theoretical ways, connecting global North, South, East is not that common. So we really want to place Art Margins in a space where the global South can be not just published in a connected way, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, but also in dialogue with the North and East. So this is a unique journal for that. So if those of you, your friends, your comrades in PhDs want to think in these connected ways, then we could be a good platform for you. What else? Am I missing anything? Well, write for us. That's a strong. Is this the time when I? He was supposed to give me a sign, which he didn't give. Oh, he's giving it now. Can I give this to you too? We have some copies with us, so please take a look. And also, we were talking about translation. Translating primary texts from the Global South in Art Margins is a very important thing. So that's also something we want to build on.
Yeah, no, Sanjukta, that was super useful and really extended what I was trying to say. I mentioned at the beginning that the problem of the margin is something sometimes people find the term margins problematic, but it really is not about sort of and sort of emphatic promoting of marginality, or it is about connection. And this notion of connecting. Let's say you mentioned the global South, South Asia, for example, and Eastern Europe, South America and Eastern Europe. So creating connections between various regions of the world. We're just, it's not directly related, but I'm editing a book about international art exhibitions in the socialist world that is really all about a history of international curatorship, that thinks about socialist curatorship as something that can act as a connector between, between regions and areas of the world that often are thought of as disconnected. Sorry, I'm ignoring you. I didn't mean to. And I may be out of time. The very last thing I wanted to show.
We are running a little bit behind time, so we'll come back to that in a moment. So I think that was a brilliant presentation. I think it really has provoked so many questions, this wonderful scholarship that you're doing. And I think your point about connecting is so important. And that also makes me think, what are we connecting, right? Like the different nodes of connection and where they're cited seems to be really important, something to reflect further on. What are the sites of production of knowledge? And when we think about epistemic justice, I suppose, where are those sites of knowledge production and what is enabled through that? And clearly, there are some nodal points that were cited, 1989, Berlin, and so on. But maybe if we shift to another site of production, so maybe Southeast of Now, I'd love to introduce the editors here, Eric, Vera, and Thanavi. Please say more about your work here. And just for those who, maybe just a small preface would be to say that Southeast of Now is a peer-reviewed journal. It's, I guess, housed at NUS Press, which is based in Singapore, but attends to Southeast Asia and then beyond that. But I think the name is really intriguing because it's Southeast of Now. Yeah. So maybe, Vera, if I hand that over to you to speak a little bit more about it.
Sure. Thank you so much for having us on this panel. Hi, everybody. My name is Vera May. I'm one of the editorial collective of Southeast of Now, joined by Thanavi and Eric, who will introduce themselves. I'm an art historian and a curator, like many on our editorial collective. So Southeast of Now is an academic peer-reviewed journal, which also hosts translations, artist pages, reviews, and it really started as a conversation at the end of 2013 where there was a lot of regional fervor, I guess, around exhibition making. So there were, at the time, at the end of 2013, the beginning of 2014, a noticeable amount of regionalist conversation at that time, based in Singapore, looking at different initiatives, which really took the idea of Southeast Asian contemporary art to look at how amorphous it had been growing, as well as the different cross-regional currents through the medium of exhibitions, primarily, is what we noticed we were encountering. However, we noticed that from the people that were at the beginning of that conversation, that a lot of journals that addressed art history were either kind of sort of widespread and global and unspecific, and a lot of area studies journals were not necessarily addressing art. So we wanted to kind of, I guess, be part of a community of scholars that, to sort of champion the important work that we were seeing in the region, but as emerging scholars ourselves at the time, did not necessarily know where to look for the material consistently. So in the region, there have been other initiatives, but they had either sort of been short-lived or very itinerant. So we, from that initial conversation, wanted to develop something that would not necessarily be authoritative of the region, but at least be a starting point for a conversation around a regionalist comparison of different art histories that were problematizing the idea of Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art. You'll see two versions of our initial logo. So it was always important for us to have the kind of, I guess, subtitle Directions in Contemporary and Modern Art to, not sort of prioritize the modern over the contemporary as being the beginning, but really to think about, the progression of art history in a different way. But also that, our compass coordinate is really this idea of the Southeast and to problem this idea of Southeast Asia. But the demands of, I guess, different publishing and indexing meant that we had to add Directions in Contemporary modern art in Asia as a way for people to find our material and to be sort of more located. So that's, I guess, been an interesting aspect of this publishing journey. We're hosted out of NUS Press, and part of that is because they allow us to be free and open access online. So it was always important for us to have a platform where people could find our material easily, but also access it for free. So you'll see, our founding members, and then our current editorial collective has expanded, which I think is partially indicative of how, at the time as emerging scholars, we sort of found and built more of a community of conversation and dialogue and have expanded. And our advisors, predominantly people that we have either had contact with or been in conversation with. And when we started the journal, a lot of us were working in and around the region or had ties to the region. I guess we're notably not necessarily connected to an American university, so it was important for us to be located in Southeast Asia.
Hi, I'm Thanavi. Nice to meet you. I will be the second speaker for some weeks of now. So these are the issues that we have published. So we, as Vera said, we have in print and also online. The online version is kind of free for read and download. So for these issues, we have like 2 issues a year, or sometimes we make a double issues. So the content inside, besides the peer review articles, we also publish interview reviews, exhibition reviews, book reviews, and we also do translation. And for the peer review articles, we have just gained a status of a Scopus Index journal. So we have to maintain at least 4 peer review articles per issue, which we have been struggling to keep that constantly. And beside the peer review articles, we have several other types of articles that peer review or not peer review. We also have a kind of collective or thinking together kind of writing. For example, we have what we call roundtable articles. One is on the terms art, modern, and contemporary in vernacular Southeast Asian languages, where we have several other scholars to contribute to the topic. So we have the how is art called and understood in Lao language, for example. The other roundtable article is on teaching art history in Southeast Asia and beyond, for example. We also have guest edited issues, or sometimes we have special issues like thematic issues. So these are the main contents. And I also want to emphasize that we put we also think translation is very important. We want to have the writings in vernacular languages be translated into English so that it would be more accessible, more for sharing. So this is one of the examples of the translated of the primary source in our journals.
Hi everyone, I'm Eric, a recent member of the collective. So I joined Southeast of Now about 1.5 years ago, and Thanavi has brought up this really important point about the kind of requirements to maintain a place in the Scopus Index, that we're required to publish 8 peer-reviewed articles a year, and sometimes we struggle to even meet that requirement, and perhaps it would be important to talk about the kind of voluntary labor that is involved in the making and the maintenance of a journal. And so I was sort of brought in, I think, to kind of lighten the workload of some of these founding editors and people who have been like working on the journal for years. But speaking on the readership for the journal, back in 2019, we saw about like 3,000 downloads, but that number has increased substantially over the next few years. In 2022, we had about like 95,000 downloads. So that is very substantial, right? From the 3,000 in 2019. That's about like 30,000 a year over the course of like each year, like over the course of 3 years, right? Which gives you a sense of really the interest that is the interest in Southeast Asian kind of modern contemporary art history that is like emerging in the field itself, in art history. This chart gives you a sense of who is reading the content of the journal. And here you see actually about 50% of the readers are coming from the US and the Philippines. So again, that gives you a sense of actually where this field is being developed, right? And perhaps one could say that it's sort of largely based in the US and the Philippines. And yet, we do find readers from like all over, right? Surprisingly in the Russian Federation, and also, in other parts of the West, and also, of course, throughout Southeast Asia itself.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So besides writing and publishing writings, we also think about the community of scholars in the regions, as building communities of scholars and artists, and also the issues around solidarity, considering many countries in Southeast Asia has faced censorship, which includes censorship on academic works. So this is an example that how we respond to the censorship of a Thai political scientist. He's not writing about art, but this Thai political scientist, Pawin Chachawan Pongpan, he was about to publish a book with an US press, with who also supports Art Southeast of Now. So in response to that, we invite a Thai artist to create an artist space in response to the censorship situation. So this we would like to add this slide to the presentation, because we want to make it kind of visible that in building the scholarly community, we need to kind of stand together in a very different challenges and situations, and the national-based issue can also be included in our work. And for speaking of the building of the community, we also want to kind of expand the field and include and encourage young researchers and writers to create like a younger generation of people who want to write about art in different formats. So some members of the editorial collectives, which including me, Brigitta Isabella, and Eileen Legaspi Ramirez, and Simon Soon, we kind of team up with other colleagues in the region and also at After All in the UK to conduct a writing workshop for young art writers and translators in the regions. So we have done two writing workshops, and actually this writing workshop has a nickname as it's called Southeast of Tomorrow to reflect the younger generation, the generation to come. And in connection to this, we at Southeast of Now also offer two fellowships, one for one for the writer, another one for the translator. So we are not only trying to publish existing works or works by scholars who already knows how to write, but we also want to kind of cultivate the later generation, and we would like to take our journal as a platform for them.
So yeah, it was, I guess, always our intention to think about the journal in a long-term way, but to also think about problematizing the idea of Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art and its histories and how they might be told. So we're very, that we're not definitive about what Southeast Asian art is. We know that's a kind of amorphous project that, we are responsive to and hopefully part of. And yeah, and I think there's a lot of people here as part of this cohort that have contributed to the journal in some way, including you, Annie. And a lot of those initial meetings, particularly with our advisors, even though we formed before we met on an initiative that was actually supported by the Giri Foundation, Ambitious Alignments, and it actually allowed us to meet each other regularly. And that face-to-face contact has been really important as well in developing our conversations around how we contribute to this field.
Oh yeah, and so I will be co-editing the special issue on intermediality next year with our co-editor, my co-editor Chairat. And again, this is a way for us to think, perhaps, to widen the kind of disciplinary purview of the journal and to kind of address really the kind of scarcity of scholars who work specifically on modern and contemporary art history, kind of strictly through the lens of art history as a discipline, right? And to kind of look at the kinds of work that are emerging of the region and of like sort of art, modern contemporary art of the region that might not be considered strictly art historical, right? So we're kind of trying to work with scholars who might be like in cultural studies or film studies as a way to kind of like attempt to address this issue.
Thank you so much, Eric, Thanavi, Vera, for giving us a little view into the wheels that make infrastructure move. Thank you for that openness. And also, I think this is, and both your journals, you shared this focus on translation and reminding us also about it's not just language that we need to translate, but it's also ideas and concepts in terms of expanding, challenging these notions that we think. The notions even, I love your examples of art, modern, and contemporary. Those three really loaded words that even overwhelm electricity in Lahore and keep them constantly in play. With that, I'm going to invite our next presenters.
Hello, everyone. My name is Seher Naveed. I'm an artist, and I also have a teaching practice. I work in the Fine Art Department at the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture, which is in Karachi. We have a research publication called Hybrid, which is very young. It was initiated in 2016, and the first volume came out in 2017. So we're pretty young. We're in the process of working on our 7th volume, which is titled Hot. our just for background's sake, the purpose of this journal was to kind of encourage a transdisciplinary scholarship and reading and sharing of knowledge, because our college has 5 different programs which we offer. And we wanted to converge these into within the hybrid publication. So we're a transdisciplinary journal, and we want to look at how art design and architecture and other genres critically address culture, political, environmental, and educational issues. But we're also interested in the other side of it, where we invite people from other fields such as anthropology or literature or scientists, and we want to see how what their information and their scholarship, how is that coming into perspectives of art and design. Our journals are, if you go into the next slide, so the founding editorial board, you can see, has shifted, and that's mainly because the faculty at our college is looking at is part of our journal. And this is on rotation, so after every 3 to 4 years. But more recently now, whoever is available to be part of the editorial board is invited and becomes part of the research. How we work is every year. We're an annual journal and we're a thematic journal. So every year we'll have one faculty who takes on lead as a lead editor, and come up with a theme. I've just mentioned some themes here. The last 6 journals, we started with archive, conflict, concrete, risk, soliloquy, forgetting, and hot, as I mentioned, which is in development. Each of these themes is taken on by a faculty member who then curates different sorts of scholarship for the publication. We have an open call through which we make, that's our main way of selecting contributions. But often we also reach out to artists or designers or scholars who we feel could be a very important part of our journal. We focus on different contents in the journal that we feel are important, which is the editorial, of course, but we will have 2 lead essays. We have a dialogue essay, which is short communications, or there's field research in the form of notes. We do a photo essay. We have a portfolio and a curatorial perspective, in which, again, we're not interested in showcasing a review of artworks, but we want to understand or place these artworks through a certain critical lens, often coming by the artists themselves, or we'll have a curator who'll group various practices or a practice within the main thematic of the journal. When we have artists writing about their work, they usually take 2 different formats. So it's either writing around their practice, various interests, various varied influences that are maybe directly or indirectly, in most cases, influencing their works, or we would have artists talking specifically about technicalities or processes in their work, again from a critical point of view, which will look into environmental matters, which will look into infrastructure, which will look into various ideas within urbanity or wherever their practice is. One of which I find a very interesting section in our journal is craft. And here we talk about different forms of craft, which don't necessarily have to be indigenous, but are also quite new. So we are based in Karachi, and the city has such a heavy presence in everyone's lives. And there's so much movement and chaos in the city, and there's all kinds of new materials coming in. And craft essentially becomes a very important aspect because there's different types of making and methods constantly being introduced in the city. And then another important aspect of the journal is the student essay. So that is quite varied again as well. So students will bring their interest or some theme that they are focused on into our research. Often we found that these are either your senior level students or students from the graduate MPhil program at IVS who will make contributions. Is there anything else? Yeah, I think so. We're very interested in showcasing research which focuses on national and regional contexts in Pakistan and South Asia. But we've also often in our 7 volumes been open to research coming from outside of Pakistan, which we feel could be made, could become part of our concerns and be in dialogue with our concerns. I think I'm going to give it to Kiran to talk about design.
So my name is Kiran Ahmad. I'm primarily a graphic designer and also an academic. I teach at the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture in the Communication Design Department. While we've spoken greatly about publications and academic journals here, I will slightly take the conversation forward and talk about design. Okay, so my design philosophy is inspired by a minimalist approach. The practice addresses an interplay of space and form. The underlying grid is meticulously used, and the simplicity or the complexity and the look and feel and the font choices and all kind of is contextualized and conceptualized by looking at the content itself. So those decisions are made keeping that in mind. And there is a use of principles and elements of design and a strong focus on repetition and rhythm that echoes throughout the editorial design, with a balance between the negative and the positive spaces as well. In moving forward, as Seher just talked about, the hybrid journal is something that I've been looking at for the past 6 years now. It fosters a culture of research and writing at IVS. And as Seher has said, that it is an interdisciplinary journal that focuses on that is interdisciplinary and also transdisciplinary in nature. These are some of the pages. We look at the complexity and the simplicity of the grid also by looking at the content itself. And then the Lahore Biennale reader. The reader is also something that I've worked on with Iftikhar Dadi, and it's assembled scholarly and curatorial essays that engage questions of cultural politics in the global South. It also aligns with the Biennale, and in which we look at how it includes reflections of the Biennale and also includes essays based on presentations at the Biennale of the academic forum, and along with contributions from various creative practitioners, curators, researchers, and academics. The second reader should be coming out hopefully this week. So if you are around while that happens, it would be great for you to see it. And then moving forward. So this is another book that I had done with Chris Moffat, The Time of Building Kamil Khan Mumtaz in Architecture in Pakistan. Through various conversations with Chris, we came to conceptualize the project as a teaching resource for architectural students studying, particularly in Pakistan, and also those who are interested in our context. It is also a guide for how to engage wider worlds and histories with thoughtfulness and commitment and care, which is also very close to Kamil Khan's practice itself. This is also an open source. it's also looked at a portable archive, and that was one of the reasons why we delved into archival material, looking at his practice from modernism to traditionalism, and how we try to reflect that also through design. And then we have Manzar, art and architecture from Pakistan, 1940s to today. If you're in Doha, please go and see it. It's up for the next 3 months. The exhibition presents modernities and contemporary practices from Pakistan, and spanning over 8 decades, Manzar traces and sets a dialogue with regional styles, international movements, and world histories, looking at connections in the subcontinent and on a global scale. And while I have worked on, and this is, I'll just pause here for a second so you can see the design layout. And that too, you can see that it is also using documentation and archival ways of looking and also contextualizing the conversation that we're having in the exhibition and also in the book itself. So, which leads me to my own research, which is Print Archive Pakistan, which I started in 2021. So looking at publication and editorial design and the various projects that I've worked on, it basically, it's an archive dedicated to documenting and preserving Pakistan history through print media. It aims at looking at print as an archive that is dedicated, basically looking at the many years of, say, Pakistan and fashion. We're also touching upon advertisements, art, design, typography, printing, and production. And similarly, looking at these many projects, we understand how they also contribute to archival material, not just a way of looking at the past, but also the present. And I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you so much for these actually really rich presentations. And I love also the fact that we are ending in a way by what we started, as to what does it mean to see, and what are the instruments that can help us see and make sense. But maybe if I can set the ball rolling by another thing which you all shared, and of the roundtables, as you would have noticed, they were split evenly between kind of content and infrastructure. So thinking about the institution and then the publication. Yep, is this better? Great. So thinking about infrastructure, the institution, and the publication. And as we understood it from the 3 publications that we focused on, they have different relationships to that. So with the hybrid, it is part of an institutional agenda. So in a way, its life is part and parcel of that institution. With art margins, you talked about the fact that while the name may be the same for 25 years, there have been many different art margins. And with Southeast of Now, we're getting a very clear flavor of you're acting, building capacity for thinking about what that Southeast of tomorrow will be. So maybe the question to you, let me frame it slightly provocatively, is that should institutions live forever?
I do not know about living forever, but I think institutions, willingly or unwillingly, have to grow. Often it's unwilling, and that battle is worth having, and that brings in some dynamism. I mean, we are all, whether we like it or not, institutional people in different contexts. As teachers, students, curators, I do not know, publishers. Yeah, that would be my thought, growing.
Something similar. I don't think institutions can live forever as is. I think they have to constantly reflect, and even if they don't want that, there's people that keeps changing, and with that change in people, there's naturally going to be change in ideas, and and from a different lens, if institutions do have this thing that they do want to live for, if for institutions that do have a vision of living forever, the vision itself keeps changing. So the global trends change, concerns change, interests change. Your student body, for instance, is changing. So the younger generation is very different from say who we are sitting right now, and the way they see the world, the way they're going to approach narratives and ideas is going to be very vastly different from how we do it. So there is that growth is going to be there.
Sure. Yeah, I guess part of our interest in developing emerging writers, emerging translators, really preparing the next generation, and also why our editorial has grown so much is because it's really a capacity issue as well, that the journal needs to evolve, that actually also after a few issues and a few rounds of peer review, your pool of people, you're connected to more people, but you also sort of, there's also less division, less people you can call upon to sort of support what you're trying to do in terms of labor. So it sort of shows the expansiveness of the field, but also on the one hand, the narrowness of how quickly you can find each other. So it's important for us that the field absolutely grows and we grow with it. Yeah.
Implicit in your question, of course, is the idea that that journals are institutions. And that in itself is an interesting proposition. And it seems like, at least in our case, where it was pulled in two directions. I mean, there is a strong imperative to self-institutionalize, right? You want to be recognizable. You want to be a brand. You want people to respect you, and they will only do that if they, if you are recognizable. Yet on the other hand, there's a price you pay for excessive institutionalization. For example, a peer-reviewed journal follows all these academic rules and formats and procedures that actually, and I was really struck by Hybrid because, they publish so many formats that in a regular academic publication, it would be very hard to sustain or to place, right? Because there's so much emphasis, and when you are in this academic publishing context, then peer review is, all important, and that determines, the way articles are written, and that is also part of institutionalization. It is the enforcement of a certain style. That's something else we grapple with a lot. That somehow we're finding that all the articles that get submitted to the journal sound like US seminar papers. And that's a huge problem. So being institutional is both important and deadly at the same time.
Yeah, no, great. I'd like to pick up on that actually, and maybe go back to this question of epistemic justice that was mentioned earlier. Because I think, we're going back also to the idea of the material and immaterial and connection. And so thinking about translation, which also then allows for the fact that there's mistranslation or gaps in translation. And then if we're thinking about connections, especially between different fields of scholarship or periods in context, then where are the disconnects as well, right? So I'm just wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more to that, something a bit more about the other negative spaces that come into play or are not in play that maybe we don't see when we see the final kind of print or the final issue. Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to allude to is I see a lot of efforts, I think, in terms of thinking about epistemic justice, whether it's collecting scholarships, whether you're enabling the next generation, making capacity. But I'm also thinking about how difficult sometimes that is, right? Even when we consciously do the work of affording for vernacular translation, there are still gaps, there are still disconnects, right? So I guess I'm eager to hear your reflections on that journey of continually trying to make something more equitable, more accessible, and so on.
Yeah, I guess it was always important for us to, publish material that was brought to us that was quite new or surprising or lesser known, that was not necessarily something we were familiar with. So, we have articles by scholars who bring us things that we had not sort of considered or thought about. And just to kind of make space also for, non-academic pages so that it also can, we can also accommodate maybe things that don't necessarily have a place to exist or to have a platform. That was always something in ongoing conversation, which is why we also have like artist pages, but these roundtables as well, as like to have kind of, I guess, more frank conversation and bringing different people together who might not necessarily be conversant. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point you raised. Justice is a big word, I don't know, but from the history of Art Margins, I can say that the early incarnation of the journal in the early 2000s, that was focused on Eastern Europe. It had an unashamedly compensatory impulse. In other words, the idea was to make visible artists from a region of the world, in that case, Eastern Europe, who really had no exposure or very little exposure before. And our idea was to use the internet to give them, that exposure, not just to show their work, but also to allow, people to write about that work, to give them that form of exposure in the form of, critical discussions, reviews, and so forth. So in that sense, I think, yes, journals can fulfill that function. I think it's a very important one. And obviously with respect to the Global South, that is one of the key function I think journals have.
Thank you. I also wanted to just appreciate that graph you showed us, Eric, on readership. And that idea of 30,000 downloads per year was a really interesting sort of number to kind of chew around. Because, we've grown up with, or some of us have grown up with this idea that the academic article is read by 2.4 people, each. And some of them, and the number may be higher and lower. So I'd like, maybe for the three journals here to just reflect on what you've seen on readership, not just in numbers, but from what the type of people who are accessing your article. Who are these 30,000 people? And maybe we can start with Eric and then sort of move to the other journals.
Well, I only just learned about the number recently, actually, but I guess I can speak from my own personal experience, being a PhD student and, just going through the submissions that we're getting for the journal, and also kind of it's really helping me get a sense actually of the kind of like scholarship that's coming out of the region, but also the kinds of methodology that different scholars are exploring and experimenting with in writing about art of the region. And I use some of the articles in the kind of like classes that I teach as well, and just as a way to kind of introduce the art that's coming out of the region and scholarship on art of the region to students who might be completely unexposed to, modern contemporary art of Southeast Asia. So, I could only speak from my own experience, I guess. But I guess Vera would be able to speak more about who might be reading, the journal more widely.
I mean, just to kind of add, like, we were really surprised as well, and also wonder who these 30,000 people are per year. Oh, thank you. Yeah, but I think it is, through classrooms, through professors referring their students, through sharing things online. We have a relatively active Facebook group that seems to get quite a lot of traffic, and that's where we also, other scholars from the region and people interested have also used that Facebook group tied to our journal to sort of promote their materials and what they're publishing, which is really great because it's kind of nice to have something somewhat centralized.
I just want to add that if I'm not wrong, I think I noticed that one of the articles that get most downloaded is the teaching art history, the roundtable article, like teaching art history in Southeast Asia or teaching Southeast Asian art history. That's one of the articles that most people seem to download. So, and I think that kind of says something about art history as a discipline that has been practiced globally. So even though we kind of focus on the region, but it's not kind of exclusive or limited within the interest of the region. And that's one of the topic that has been interest by people outside.
So I think in our context, we've noticed that hybrid is definitely being used as a resource by faculty in their classes, and I think because there is theory is something, art theory is something that that we're still not entirely comfortable with in art schools in Pakistan. So, and most of the theory that you do study and you in art schools here is coming from a very Western lens. So I think there's one thing, the fact that hybrid is there is kind of bringing in a lot of local ideas and content and research, which is from what I know is at the moment being used by faculty in our institutions. And I hope that it's able to get out to other students who are interested in similar things. But we're still very young, and I know that from my journey yesterday from Karachi to Lahore, I realized that a lot of people don't know about hybrid because they're like, "Why are you going to Lahore?" And it's like, we're going to be on a panel talk for publications. They're like, "What does Indus have to do with publications?" So we have a journal, and a lot of people didn't know. So there's obviously this gap in. And this could be argumentative about is it marketing? Are we not present enough on social media? Is there not enough people talking about our work, going of contributors' work in the journal? So there's that assessment that I think still needs to be figured out and made.
Actually, that's a really good point to segue into my other question, because I was really thinking about how all your publications have a print life and also function online, right? And that also makes me think, of course, of the use of social media, but not just for circulation and expanding distribution, but I'm also thinking of what it means to exist online. I think, Sven, I read your article after Archive, which is really informative. And I'm also thinking then, how does that affect the editorial way of working? Like, does that make space for other kinds of commissioning or other kinds of writing and thinking about how that functions in that space? I wonder if perhaps you could also speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back also to this previous question about readership, things are really changing, or they have already changed. In other words, much as I would like to think that there are people who wait for every issue of Art Margins to come off the press, and then, they sit in their armchair and they read it from the first to the last page. That's not happening. Instead, people, I think, increasingly, the way we use or consume journals is that we download individual articles. Maybe we even check a print issue out of the library and then read an individual article, but a lot of it is download now. And things like JSTOR and similar aggregators, that's of course exactly how they disseminate the content, as that's what that's called. In that sense, in some ways, I sometimes do wonder if journals are a dying breed, if that's really a model that's going to continue, because it is essentially a book, right? It's a book between two covers, and with a sort of very sequential idea in a way. And that's how we curate journals, as if we're looking at them, like sequential chapters. But in actual fact, that's not the reality of how people use journals anymore. So so definitely things are changing a great deal. And that's why also looking at subscriptions alone is not enough. You have to really look at how many people download articles and so forth. But in some ways, like I said, the idea of downloading individual articles goes against the grain of the journal, because in the journal, the article is embedded in an issue where it has been placed with a lot of deliberation, not just randomly. But that's not how people use it. So there's a weird disconnect that's opening up. Yeah.
No, I 100% agree. There is a disconnect in the whole idea or the act of just downloading separate articles, which does create gaps in editorial as well. But one of the things that I think has worked for hybrid in the one or two times we've done this is have a discussion around the journal as well. So often at our university, we have we do a launch every year. And the physical launch is again something very similar to are people still reading? Do people really show up to the launch of these journals? But what we did find that was happening a lot was the numbers showing up for online launches, and this online discussion is a great place for, even if someone is individually is interested in an individual contribution or an individual essay. I think just being part or present in that discussion, they'll still be able to understand the presence of that specific essay in context of the journal and in context to other relations with other essays. So the discussion, I think, around these is very important, and if that doesn't die, we could remain.
So I think actually that was a really lovely reminder about the importance of the physical again, about connection, about people, about being in presence. And I may be mistaken, but I think the Park Tea House, at Park Tea House, we have a work of Bani Abadi's, which was originally commissioned by Art Margins, no, as an encounter. So thinking about that life of what happens to the journal, I think that's a really nice idea to end on. Is that things could take place for a journal, and then find that life in a place like the Tea House, with people who may have never heard of Bani Abadi, or certainly would not have heard of Art Margins, but are looking at, intrigued by, thinking about how that work that comes out of these academic institutions has the capacity to leak into the real world. And with that, I'm going to sort of just wrap up here. Thank this wonderful panel, all of you guys, and our hosts.